Back to Israel now, where public anger aimed at Benjamin Netanyahu's government is on the rise. More and more Israelis, including members of Netanyahu's own cabinet, accuse the Prime Minister of sabotaging ceasefire negotiations that would bring Israeli captives in Gaza home. But as protesters flooded the streets of Tel Aviv demanding that Netanyahu step down, there has been noticeably little criticism of the savagery being wrought upon the Palestinians of Gaza, the war crimes committed in the name of the Israeli state. Daniel Levy is a former senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister's office and, going back to the early 90s, was part of Israel's negotiation team during the Oslo peace process. He knows Israeli politics from the inside out and is now the president of the U.S. Middle East Peace Project. Daniel Levy, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let's start with the hundreds of thousands of Israelis we saw on the streets protesting this week, demanding that Benjamin Netanyahu resign, even calling for a ceasefire in order to get those captives home, but not demanding an end to an 11-month-long genocide in Gaza, right? Unpack that for us, please.
So let's be clear that there is a cohort within that protest movement who are very aware of Palestinian realities today, predating October 7th, and for whom this is the way to at least end the immediate horrors. That is a small minority. You have a larger cohort of Israelis who are skeptical about the leadership, Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich. They may know that not everything is okay, but the preponderance of what they're identifying with here is the fate of those hostages. And they're saying, look, you neglected those people once on October 7th, the failures that led to that, and now you are neglecting them again by refusing to do a deal, and they are placing the lion's share of the blame at the feet of Prime Minister Netanyahu. But if you want to understand at a deeper level, why are we not seeing more of an outcry as to what is going on there, then sure, October 7th, let's not make light of it. That's a traumatic experience, but it's 11 months later. What Israelis have been treated to is a relentless media barrage, which has served this idea that nothing to see there, anything that's happening in Gaza is Hamas's fault. A prime minister, of course, and a leadership that continue to offer a lot of lies. We saw that in the press conferences, rare press conferences given by Prime Minister Netanyahu. An opposition that does not offer opposition. So the entirety of the Zionist political spectrum in Parliament is behind this war. None are questioning the war. If you dig further, the decades of dehumanization of Palestinians, the inability to see that humanity and equality, in a way, you couldn't keep Palestinians living under those conditions. You couldn't maintain what the International Court of Justice has now called an apartheid regime if you weren't dehumanizing Palestinians long before all this began.
The fate of the captives is central to the media debate in Israel right now. It's personal for a lot of Israelis, let's face it. But is anyone really confronting the reality that Netanyahu has no intention of a deal that would bring them home? That in the warped world of Israeli politics, a country that we continually hear described as the only democracy in the Middle East, somehow it suits the Prime Minister to continue this war.
I think it's important to pause on how personal this is, not just because, yes, there would be people who knew those being held in Gaza, but also because for 300 plus days, those personal stories have been piped into everyone's home. An Israeli friend of mine described this almost like a reality show because you'd been exposed to so many of those personal stories. So that, we have to have that in the background of our analysis. And it might surprise those watching us to know that many in Israel are far more critical of their prime minister, of the leadership he offers in terms of who is to blame for this. And they look at this and they don't say what the US administration is saying, which is, well, it all depends on Hamas. All of the blame is on Hamas. They're saying, no, Prime Minister Netanyahu. And they're using this terminology at the protests and in the Bibi-critical media. The blood is on your hands. Secondly, Netanyahu is trying to rebuild himself politically as the indispensable, irreplaceable wartime leader. To do that, you have to continue the war, right? But thirdly, let's not forget, this is also ideological. For Netanyahu and for his coalition and for his Likud party, is this the moment where you can deal a death blow, a knockout blow, to the idea of Palestinian rights, equality, and national aspirations for another several generations, just as the first displacement, the Nakba of 1947 to 49, did way back then?
The polls show that Israelis still overwhelmingly support the war in Gaza, but something deeper is also coming out of Israeli society, the mainstreaming of some really extremist points of view, especially about Gaza. We saw an example of that this past week, a widely shared clip from an Israeli-based podcast. Take a listen. The title of the podcast, Two Nice Jewish Boys.
Forgive us if we don't give a if, everybody there dies. It's just the way we feel. If you gave me a button to just erase Gaza, every single living being in Gaza would no longer be living tomorrow, I would press it in a second.
How accurate a reflection is that of Israeli public opinion?
Unfortunately, this is much more widespread than one would want to imagine. It's not the only voice. I don't know how exactly to quantify it, but I think what we can say is there's a strategic significance to the prevalence, the ubiquity of this kind of discourse in the media, because the sense among a significant body of Israelis is we've maintained an occupation, we've denied these people their right for decades, but this is the moment where maybe we can put an end to this, displace the Palestinians, finish the job that Ben Gurion began. So to do that, you have to inoculate your public from the ugliness of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We know what's going on, but it has to happen and it's okay. We all think like this, right? There is more to this, certainly than security, because it's not going to bring security. There is more to this than revenge. This is, for some, part of a program where Palestinian territories will be uninhabitable permanently for Palestinians. And I think that there is a legal question here as to the culpability, as to the responsibility of these broadcasters for incitement to genocide. And after the Rwanda genocide, many of the leadership of the RTLM radio station were held accountable. And we should remember that and remind people of that and look to that kind of redress.
Finally, you wrote recently that it would be smart to come up with a new starting point. The fact, you said, that America is not a friend of peace in the Middle East, but in fact, an enemy. Explain why you think that, and what should journalists understand about the changing face of politics in the Middle East right now?
The reality we still seem to live in with the Middle East is as if geopolitics, power politics in the world hasn't shifted since the Oslo process began.
1994.
1994. This unique unipolar American moment. And the US could make the claim that it can organize things. We're not there today. The US didn't deliver for the Middle East. There was more war, of course. I'm not suggesting that there is an alternative global hegemon who we should be welcoming. What I'm saying is the US acts in what it perceives to be its interest. It's not a friend of peace if peace isn't sufficiently in its interest. That's how the US acts. And it's not like the jury is still out. We have the evidence that the US is not going to deliver. What that behooves us to do is twofold. First of all, to correctly set the expectations of what the US can be encouraged and prevented from doing. Mitigate some of the damage. Stop the US from being able to continue some of the worst excesses of what it's doing in the Middle East. The other part of that story is the US is not the only player. And the more we exclusively focus on the US, the more we feed into that narrative. I would like when, the UN Security Council meets, the 2-minute sync the next day on a media channel may include one other country, but it will invariably mostly be, what did the US ambassador say at the UN? I want to know what the Chinese ambassador is saying at the Security Council. The French, I want to know what the Russians are saying. It's important. I want to know what those global South voices, who have, in the case of South Africa, taken Israel to the ICJ, in the case of the broader ICJ opinion, what Malaysia, Indonesia, the African Union, some states in the region, what they have done is to shift the legal discourse on this question. And if we are stuck in this American-centric approach, we encourage the idea that it's not your responsibility because let's just wait to see what America says. Enough of waiting. They're not going to get us out of this problem. And that's something that the Palestinians, I think, have largely internalized, but not their leadership in Ramallah. And it's something the rest of us need to internalize.
Daniel Levy, we wish you all the best with your work with the U.S. Middle East Peace Project. And thank you for joining us here at The Listening Post today.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Now hit that like button and leave us a comment to let us know what you think about anything that we covered this week. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Does anyone really call it X? Facebook and Instagram for updates from the show. Links are in the description.